O meu nome é Gonçalo Amaral. Fui investigador da Polícia Judiciária durante 27 anos. Coordenei a investigação do desaparecimento de Madeleine McCann no dia 3 de maio de 2007.
The trained cadaver dog freezes, its body suddenly alert. The handler watches as the animal's behavior shifts dramatically, tail stiffening, nose working frantically in the air. Then comes the signal they've been trained to recognize. A sharp, unmistakable bark that echoes through apartment 5A at the Ocean Club Resort in Praia da Luz. The dog has detected the scent of human death. Days later, another specialist dog alerts again, this time in the trunk of a rental car. A vehicle the McCanns didn't rent until 24 days after their daughter Madeleine disappeared. These weren't just any dogs, they were elite British police dogs with impeccable records, having successfully identified human remains in over 200 cases. Yet somehow these crucial alerts became a footnote in one of the most publicized missing persons cases in modern history. On the evening of May 3, 2007, 3-year-old Madeleine McCann vanished from her family's vacation apartment in the quiet Portuguese coastal town of Praia da Luz. Her parents, Kate and Gerry McCann, both British doctors, claimed they were dining with friends at a tapas restaurant roughly 180 feet from their apartment, checking on their 3 sleeping children periodically throughout the evening. When Kate McCann checked at around 10 p.m., she discovered Madeleine was missing, while her twin siblings continued sleeping undisturbed in the same room. What followed was an unprecedented international media frenzy. The McCanns launched a sophisticated global campaign to find their daughter, garnering support from celebrities, business tycoons, and even the Pope. The narrative that dominated headlines was clear. An innocent child had been abducted by a predator who had broken into the vacation apartment. But behind the scenes, the Portuguese investigation was heading in a different direction, led by veteran detective Gonçalo Amaral. As coordinator of the Polícia Judiciária in the region, Amaral had 27 years of investigative experience. As his team gathered evidence, analyzed witness statements, and processed forensic findings, Amaral became increasingly skeptical of the abduction theory that British media had embraced without question. 5 months into the investigation, Amaral was abruptly removed from the case, one day after a British newspaper reported that a senior British police officer had criticized Portuguese authorities. The timing wasn't coincidental. Amaral later published his findings in a controversial book titled The Truth of the Lie, presenting evidence that contradicted the abduction narrative and suggesting the McCanns may have been involved in their daughter's disappearance and a subsequent cover-up. What followed was a 15-year battle, not just for justice for Madeleine, but for the right to question the official narrative. The clash between Amaral's evidence-based investigation and the powerful media machine supporting the McCanns raises disturbing questions. Was crucial evidence suppressed? Did diplomatic pressure derail the investigation? And most importantly, was Gonçalo Amaral right all along? Before we dive deeper into this labyrinth of forensic evidence, media manipulation, and international politics, hit subscribe to join our community of true crime investigators. This channel is dedicated to examining cases where the official narrative doesn't align with the evidence, and the Madeleine McCann case might be the most significant example in recent history. Where are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments. Our global community brings diverse perspectives to these complex cases, and your insight matters as we unravel what really happened that night in Praia da Luz and in the years of controversy that followed. The events at the Ocean Club Resort in Praia da Luz unfolded like a carefully constructed thriller, one that would captivate global audiences for years to come. The timeline, as presented by the McCanns and initially accepted by authorities, began on April 28, 2007, when the family arrived in Portugal for a week-long vacation with 7 friends, later dubbed the Tapas 7 by the media. For 5 days, the group established a routine, days spent by the pool or beach, followed by dinner at the resort's tapas restaurant, while their children slept in their respective apartments. According to statements, the adults took turns checking on the children throughout the evening, an arrangement they compared to dining in their backyard while the children slept inside. On May 3rd, the McCanns' final day with Madeleine, Jerry and Kate maintained that everything proceeded normally. They put their 3 children to bed around 7:30 p.m., with Madeleine in her short-sleeved pink pajamas featuring Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh. By 8:30 p.m., the couple had joined their friends at the tapas restaurant. The checking system, as described by the group, involved adults visiting their apartments roughly every half hour. At 9:05 p.m., Jerry McCann reported checking on his children, noting that all 3 were sleeping soundly. He mentioned adjusting Madeleine's blanket and taking a moment to look at his daughter, thinking how beautiful she was, a detail he would repeat in numerous interviews. At 9:15 p.m., another member of their group, Jane Tanner, claimed she saw a man carrying a child in pajamas while she was returning to the restaurant after checking on her own children. This sighting would become a cornerstone of the abduction theory, though its timing and details would later face scrutiny. At approximately 10 p.m. came the moment that launched a global manhunt. Kate McCann went to check on their children and discovered Madeleine's bed empty. According to her account, the bedroom window was open and the shutters raised, details that would become contentious as the investigation progressed. Kate immediately raised the alarm, reportedly running back to the restaurant crying, "They've taken her! They've taken her!" What followed was chaos. Resort staff and guests formed search parties that combed the grounds and nearby beaches. Portuguese police arrived within 15 minutes, but crucial protocols for missing children cases weren't immediately implemented. No border alerts were issued until the following morning. The crime scene, apartment 5A, was not properly secured, with dozens of people entering and leaving, potentially contaminating evidence. By morning, the case had exploded across British media. The McCanns, both articulate medical professionals with connections to Britain's upper middle class, made compelling figures for public sympathy. Their first public appearance showed them walking hand in hand, Kate clutching Madeleine's stuffed toy cuddle cat, an image that would become iconic in the case. The abduction theory quickly dominated coverage, particularly in the British press. Initial reports focused on a botched burglary or a pedophile ring operating in the area. The narrative was simple and horrifying. An innocent child snatched from her bed while her parents dined nearby, a scenario that played on the primal fears of parents everywhere. Within days, the McCanns campaign reached unprecedented levels of sophistication. They established a fighting fund that would eventually exceed $2.5 million. Celebrity supporters including David Beckham, J.K. Rowling, and Richard Branson made public appeals or financial contributions. The couple was granted an audience with Pope Benedict XV, creating powerful imagery that reinforced their portrayal as grieving parents deserving of global support. British media outlets offered substantial rewards for information. The News of the World alone pledged $1.5 million. The case received more coverage than major natural disasters or wars occurring simultaneously. This wasn't just a missing person case, it had become a global phenomenon. The McCanns hired multiple PR specialists, including former BBC News anchor Clarence Mitchell, who left his position at the UK government's Central Office of Information to become their full-time spokesman. Mitchell's media savvy ensured the abduction narrative remained dominant, while any alternative theories were quickly labeled as cruel speculation or conspiracy theories. By controlling the narrative through strategic media appearances and carefully worded statements, the McCanns transformed from private citizens into public figures who inspired both immense sympathy and unprecedented support. Their status as medical professionals lent them credibility, while their composed demeanor in interviews, occasionally breaking into controlled emotion, struck a chord with viewers worldwide. This official narrative of devoted parents facing an unimaginable tragedy became so entrenched in public consciousness that questioning it was often met with hostility. The stage was set for a collision course between this carefully managed public perception and the evidence being uncovered by Portuguese investigators working behind the scenes. While the McCann's media campaign gathered momentum internationally, a veteran detective named Gonçalo Amaral was methodically building a case that would challenge everything the public thought they knew about Madeleine's disappearance. As the coordinator of the Policia Judiciaria in the Algarve region, Amaral brought 27 years of investigative experience to what would become the defining case of his career. Amaral wasn't a man easily swayed by media pressure or political considerations. Stocky, with salt and pepper hair and a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow, he embodied the image of a detective who prioritized evidence over optics. His approach was old school. Follow the evidence, establish a timeline, and consider all possibilities, including those that might prove uncomfortable or controversial. Initially, Portuguese authorities treated Madeleine's disappearance as an abduction, launching extensive searches and interviewing resort staff and guests. But as days passed without credible sightings or ransom demands, Amaral's team began noticing troubling inconsistencies in the established narrative. The first red flag emerged when forensic teams examined the bedroom window and shutters that Kate McCann claimed were open when she discovered Madeleine missing. Technical analysis revealed no fingerprints other than Kate's on the window and no signs of forced entry. The shutters, which the McCanns initially suggested had been jimmied open, showed no damage and could only be opened from inside the apartment. This physical evidence directly contradicted early statements from the McCanns' friends and family in the UK, who told British media that shutters had been jemmied, broken, or forced. These claims, which appeared to originate from the McCanns themselves, were quietly abandoned as forensic evidence proved them false. Then came a development that would permanently alter the trajectory of the investigation. In late July 2007, nearly 3 months after Madeleine's disappearance, British authorities sent specialized cadaver dogs to Portugal. These weren't ordinary police dogs. They were specifically trained to detect the scent of human decomposition even weeks or months after death, and even if attempts had been made to clean the area. The first dog, Eddie, was a cadaver dog trained to alert only to the odor of human remains. His record was impeccable, having correctly identified human remains in over 200 cases with no false positives. The second dog, Keela, was trained to detect human blood, even in microscopic amounts or after cleaning attempts. What happened next stunned investigators. Eddie alerted to the scent of human decomposition in 5 locations: behind the sofa in the McCann's apartment, in their bedroom closet on Kate McCann's clothes, on Madeleine's stuffed toy cuddle cat, and perhaps most significantly, in the trunk of a rental car the McCanns had hired 24 days after Madeleine disappeared. Keela, the blood detection dog, independently alerted to microscopic traces of blood in several of the same locations. Forensic teams took samples from these areas for DNA analysis. The implications were explosive. If accurate, the dog's findings suggested that a death had occurred in apartment 5A, and that somehow evidence of this death had been transferred to a car rented weeks later. This directly contradicted the abduction narrative that had dominated media coverage. Simultaneously, Amaral's team was uncovering significant inconsistencies in witness statements. The timeline provided by the Tapas 7 showed troubling discrepancies when cross-referenced. Jane Tanner's sighting of a man carrying a child, a cornerstone of the abduction theory, contained details that changed over multiple interviews. Most notably, another witness, an Irish family named Smith, reported seeing a man carrying a child matching Madeleine's description at a different location and time, walking toward the beach rather than away from the resort. When shown photos, Martin Smith, the patriarch of the Irish family, later stated he was 60–80% certain the man he saw was Gerry McCann himself, a bombshell revelation that received minimal coverage in British media. Perhaps most damning were the 48 questions that Kate McCann refused to answer when formally interviewed as a witness on September 7, 2007. These included basic inquiries about the night of the disappearance, her reaction upon discovering Madeleine missing, and why she hadn't searched more actively for her daughter immediately after raising the alarm. 3 days later, on September 10, 2007, the Portuguese authorities formally named Kate and Gerry McCann as arguidos, official suspects in their daughter's disappearance. The investigation had reached its turning point. This case has more twists than most realize. Hit like if you're finding this information eye-opening. The evidence Amaral uncovered painted a vastly different picture than what was being reported in most international media, particularly in Britain, where questioning the McCann's version of events had become almost taboo. What time is it where you're watching? Our true crime community spans the globe, and this case resonates differently depending on where you're located. British viewers might recognize how one-sided the coverage was in their country, while Portuguese viewers likely remember a much more nuanced presentation of the evidence. As we continue, we'll explore how Amaral's evidence-based investigation collided with an unprecedented media campaign, diplomatic pressure, and ultimately led to his controversial removal from the case, just as his theory was gaining traction. The battle between evidence and narrative was just beginning, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. In July 2008, Gonçalo Amaral published a book that would become the center of a decade-long legal battle. Titled A Verdade da Mentira, The Truth of the Lie, it presented his comprehensive theory of what happened to Madeleine McCann, a theory based not on speculation, but on the evidence his team had meticulously gathered during his time leading the investigation. Amaral's central thesis was stark and controversial. Madeleine McCann had died accidentally in apartment 5A on the evening of May 3, 2007. According to his theory, the child had not been abducted, but had died in the apartment, likely from an accidental fall while unattended. He proposed that her parents discovered her body upon returning from dinner and then concealed the death, disposed of her remains and fabricated the abduction scenario. This theory wasn't born from personal animosity toward the McCanns, as their supporters often claimed. Rather, it emerged from a constellation of evidence that, when viewed collectively, pointed away from abduction and toward a scenario involving death and concealment. The foundation of Amaral's theory rested on several key pillars of evidence. First were the cadaver and blood dog alerts, trained British police dogs that detected the scent of human decomposition and blood in specific locations within apartment 5A, on Kate McCann's clothing, on Madeleine's toy, and in the rental car obtained 24 days after the disappearance. These weren't ordinary police dogs, but specialized animals with impeccable track records in homicide investigations. Martin Grime, the dog's handler, and a respected expert in forensic canine detection, stated in his official report, no other alerts were given by either dog during the deployment, which concluded on July 31, 2007. This specificity was crucial. The dogs didn't alert randomly or frequently, making their targeted alerts all the more significant. The second pillar was DNA evidence. Samples taken from areas where the dogs alerted were sent to the Forensic Science Service in Birmingham, England. Initial reports indicated a potential match to Madeleine's DNA profile in the trunk of the rental car. However, the final report claimed the samples were too degraded for conclusive identification, a finding that has since been questioned by independent forensic experts, who noted that even partial matches deserved further investigation. The third pillar involved the timeline inconsistencies. Amaral highlighted how statements from the Tapa 7 evolved over time, with details changing in ways that appeared to strengthen the abduction narrative while eliminating contradictions. Most notably, the testimony of Jane Tanner, who claimed to have seen a man carrying a child near the McCann's apartment, contained shifting details about the man's appearance, direction of travel, and what the child was wearing. Amaral's book also detailed how the physical evidence contradicted the McCann's statements. The bedroom window and shutters showed no signs of forced entry. The children's beds showed no signs of struggle. Most tellingly, the twins continued sleeping soundly throughout the commotion following Kate's discovery that Madeleine was missing. Unusual behavior that raised questions about whether they might have been sedated, a possibility the McCanns refused to have tested at the time. Perhaps most damning was the McCanns' behavior following Madeleine's disappearance. Amaral noted their lack of cooperation with specific investigative requests, including Kate's refusal to answer 48 questions during her formal interview and their immediate hiring of criminal defense attorneys. He questioned why parents of a missing child would refuse to participate in a reconstruction of the night's events, a standard investigative procedure that could have helped clarify the timeline. The investigation reached its climax on September 7, 2007, when Portuguese authorities formally named Kate and Jerry McCann as arguidos, official suspects. This status change wasn't taken lightly. It required specific evidence meeting legal thresholds. The couple was questioned separately for hours, with Kate declining to answer nearly all questions on advice from her lawyer. Then came the moment that would forever alter the course of the investigation. On October 2, 2007, just weeks after the McCanns were named suspects, and exactly one day after a British newspaper criticized Portuguese police, Gonçalo Amaral was removed from the case. The official reason given was that he had criticized British police in comments to a Portuguese newspaper. The timing couldn't have been more suspicious. What wasn't widely reported was the extraordinary level of British political intervention in the case. Diplomatic cables later revealed that the British ambassador to Portugal was directly involved in discussions about the investigation. The McCanns had direct phone contact with then Prime Minister Gordon Brown. Clarence Mitchell, the McCanns spokesman, openly stated, "I was working closely with the British government at the time, and the Portuguese were already beginning to get a bit frustrated about the involvement of the British government." This political pressure coincided with a coordinated media campaign to discredit Amaral and Portuguese authorities. British tabloids portrayed him as incompetent, overweight, and alcoholic, stereotypes that played into British prejudices about Southern European officials. His removal effectively derailed the investigation's direction, and by July 2008, Portuguese authorities archived the case, citing insufficient evidence. Amaral, now free from the constraints of his official position, published his book detailing the evidence that had led him to conclude the McCanns were involved in their daughter's disappearance and the subsequent cover-up. The book sold over 180,000 copies in Portugal alone and was translated into multiple languages, except English, as British publishers feared legal action from the McCanns. The McCanns' response was swift and aggressive. They launched a $1.2 million lawsuit against Amaral, claiming his book damaged their reputation and hindered the search for Madeleine. A Portuguese court initially ruled in their favor, banning the book and awarding damages. However, this decision was later overturned by Portugal's Supreme Court, which ruled that Amaral's right to freedom of expression outweighed the McCanns' reputation concerns, especially since his theories were based on the official investigation. If you're wondering why this crucial evidence wasn't more widely reported, share this video to help others understand the full story. The disparity between what Portuguese audiences knew about the case and what British audiences were told represents one of the most striking examples of narrative control in modern crime reporting. Amaral's counter-narrative wasn't the wild conspiracy theory it was portrayed to be in British media. It was the methodical conclusion of an experienced detective following evidence to its logical end, evidence that raised profound questions about what really happened to Madeleine McCann on that May evening in 2007. The conflict between Gonçalo Amaral and the McCanns didn't end with his removal from the investigation or the archiving of the case. Instead, it transformed into a protracted legal battle that would span more than a decade, crossing multiple courts and ultimately reaching the European Court of Human Rights. These legal proceedings weren't merely about a book or personal reputation. They represented a fundamental clash between freedom of expression and the right to privacy, between an investigator's conclusions and a family's narrative. In July 2009, almost exactly 1 year after Amaral published The Truth of the Lie, the McCanns filed a $1.2 million lawsuit against him in Lisbon. Their claim was multifaceted. They alleged that Amaral's book and subsequent documentary caused them severe emotional distress, damaged their reputation, and, perhaps most significantly, hampered the ongoing search for Madeleine by suggesting she was dead. The initial ruling seemed decisive. In September 2009, a Portuguese judge granted an injunction against Amaral, ordering his book to be pulled from shelves and prohibiting further publication or discussion of his theories. For 12 months, The Truth of the Lie was effectively banned in Portugal, with existing copies seized from bookstores and warehouses. Amaral, already financially strained after leaving the police force, faced potential ruin. The tide began to turn in October 2010 when a higher Portuguese court overturned the injunction, ruling that the temporary ban on Amaral's book violated his constitutional right to freedom of expression. This decision allowed the truth of the lie to return to circulation while the main defamation case continued through the courts. The central trial finally concluded in April 2015 with another devastating blow to Amaral. The court ordered him to pay $500,000 in damages to the McCanns, a sum that would have bankrupted the former detective. Media outlets worldwide reported this as vindication for the McCanns and confirmation that Amaral's theories were baseless. But the legal saga was far from over. Amaral immediately appealed, and in April 2016 the Portuguese appellate court completely reversed the lower court's decision. Not only was Amaral absolved of paying damages, but the court explicitly recognized that his book was based on the official investigation and represented his professional opinion as the detective who had led that investigation. The McCanns appealed to Portugal's Supreme Court, which delivered its final verdict in January 2017. In a comprehensive 76-page ruling, the Supreme Court not only upheld Amaral's right to publish his theories, but made several crucial determinations that received surprisingly little coverage in British media. First, the court stated that the McCanns had not been cleared of involvement in their daughter's disappearance. The case had merely been archived due to insufficient evidence. Second, it affirmed that Amaral's right to professional expression and opinion outweighed the McCanns' reputation concerns. Most significantly, the court noted that the McCanns had voluntarily placed themselves in the public eye and had actively courted media attention, thus diminishing their expectation of privacy. Undeterred, the McCanns took their case to the European Court of Human Rights, ECHR, in Strasbourg, arguing that Portugal had failed to protect their rights. In September 2022, after a 5-year deliberation, the ECHR delivered a decisive ruling in Amaral's favor. The court determined that Amaral's freedom of expression was justified, particularly given his role in the investigation and the fact that his book was based on information that had already entered the public domain through official case files. These legal victories carried profound implications beyond the immediate case. By repeatedly ruling in Amaral's favor, the courts effectively legitimized his right to present an alternative narrative, one based on evidence rather than emotion. The Portuguese Supreme Court explicitly stated that its ruling did not determine what happened to Madeleine, but it did affirm that Amaral's theory represented a legitimate interpretation of the available evidence. For Amaral, these rulings provided vindication after years of character assassination in British media. For the McCanns, they represented a significant setback in their efforts to control the narrative surrounding their daughter's disappearance. And for objective observers, the rulings offered a sobering reminder that court decisions based on evidence often diverge from media narratives shaped by sympathy and public relations. Perhaps most importantly, these legal battles demonstrated how differently the case was perceived in Portugal versus the United Kingdom. While British media largely portrayed Amaral as a villain persecuting grieving parents, Portuguese courts repeatedly recognized him as a professional presenting evidence-based conclusions from an official investigation. What's the weather like where you are? Our criminal instinct community spans every climate, from the sunny beaches of Portugal to the rainy streets of London, places where this case played out so differently in the public consciousness. The contrast between how this case was perceived across different countries reminds us that truth often depends on which information we're exposed to and which narratives we're encouraged to believe. 16 years after Madeleine McCann's disappearance, the case remains riddled with inconsistencies and contradictions that have never been adequately explained. These lingering questions aren't merely fodder for internet sleuths. They represent significant gaps in the official narrative that continue to trouble objective observers. Perhaps the most glaring inconsistency involves the timeline of May 3, 2007. The McCanns and their friends provided statements that, when cross-referenced, contain irreconcilable discrepancies about who was where and when. Most notably, the gemmed shutters initially reported to family and media in the UK were quickly disproven by forensic examination, yet this fundamental contradiction was never adequately addressed. The behavior of the cadaver and blood dogs remains unexplained in the context of an abduction scenario. The McCann's explanation, that the dogs were unreliable, or that Kate's clothing might have been contaminated through her work with deceased patients, contradicts the established science of cadaver dog capabilities and the specific training of these particular animals. No explanation has ever been offered for how the scent of decomposition could appear in a car rented 24 days after Madeleine disappeared. Kate McCann's refusal to answer 48 questions during formal questioning has never been fully explained beyond legal strategy. These weren't invasive or irrelevant questions. They were basic inquiries about the night of the disappearance that any parent of a missing child would typically be eager to clarify. Similarly, the McCanns' refusal to participate in a crime scene reconstruction, a standard investigative procedure, remains difficult to reconcile with their public pleas for answers. The DNA evidence continues to provoke debate among forensic experts. The Forensic Science Service's conclusion that samples were too degraded for definitive identification has been questioned by independent experts who note that even partial matches warranted further investigation. The decision not to retest these samples using more advanced techniques available today represents a missed opportunity for clarity. In 2020, the case took an unexpected turn when German prosecutors announced they had identified a new suspect. Christian Bruckner, a German national with a history of sexual offenses who was living in Praia da Luz at the time of Madeleine's disappearance. Prosecutors stated they believe Madeleine is dead and that Bruckner was responsible, though they have yet to file formal charges or reveal the specific evidence supporting these claims. Bruckner's emergence as a suspect has been presented in some media as vindication of the abduction theory and refutation of Amaral's conclusions. However, a closer examination reveals a more nuanced reality. German prosecutors have not disclosed any physical evidence linking Bruckner to apartment 5A or to Madeleine herself. Their case appears to rest largely on circumstantial evidence and alleged confessions to associates, evidence that has yet to be tested in court. Interestingly, Gonçalo Amaral himself acknowledged Bruckner in his 2008 book, noting that he was investigated and eliminated as a suspect during the original inquiry. Amaral has publicly expressed skepticism about the new focus on Bruckner, suggesting it represents an attempt to create an official perpetrator rather than a genuine breakthrough. He has challenged German authorities to reveal concrete evidence connecting Bruckner to Madeleine's disappearance. The Bruckner development highlights a crucial aspect of this case, the difference between evidence and narrative. While his criminal history makes him a plausible suspect in an abduction scenario, the evidence publicly disclosed thus far doesn't address the forensic findings that led Amaral to his conclusions. The cadaver dog alerts, DNA questions, and timeline inconsistencies remain unexplained, even if Bruckner was somehow involved. Why does this case continue to captivate public attention long after other missing children cases have faded from memory? The answer lies partly in its perfect storm of elements: photogenic, upper-middle-class victims, exotic location, suspicious circumstances, and international diplomatic tensions. But perhaps more significantly, the case represents a rare instance where the official narrative, supported by unprecedented media coverage and political intervention, faces serious challenges from documented evidence. The media's role in shaping public perception cannot be overstated. British newspapers, particularly tabloids, adopted the McCann's perspective almost universally, portraying them as beyond reproach and treating alternative theories as heresy. This created a stark contrast with Portuguese media, which reported more extensively on the evidence uncovered by investigators. The result was two parallel narratives developing in different countries, one evidence-based, one emotion-driven. This media divergence explains why many British observers remain convinced of the McCann's complete innocence, while Portuguese and international observers tend to view the case with more skepticism. It's a powerful demonstration of how media framing can shape public opinion more effectively than actual evidence. As we approach the third decade since Madeleine's disappearance, the case stands as a testament to the power of narrative control in the modern media landscape. Despite court rulings affirming Amaral's right to present his evidence-based theory, despite forensic findings never adequately explained, and despite timeline inconsistencies never resolved, the abduction narrative remains dominant in many circles, not because it better explains the evidence, but because it has been more effectively promoted and protected. The truth about what happened to Madeleine McCann may never be known with certainty, but what we can know, what the evidence clearly shows, is that the case is far more complex and troubling than the simplified version that dominated headlines for years. And in that complexity lies the enduring fascination with a mystery that continues to defy resolution. As we've journeyed through the labyrinth of evidence, legal battles, and media narratives surrounding Madeleine McCann's disappearance, one conclusion becomes inescapable. Gonçalo Amaral's counter-narrative has withstood extraordinary attempts to silence it. Despite character assassination, legal challenges, and political pressure, his evidence-based theory remains standing. Not because it's comfortable or convenient, but because it addresses questions the official narrative cannot. The resilience of Amaral's perspective isn't merely a matter of personal vindication. His theory has endured because it accounts for the forensic evidence that the abduction narrative struggles to explain. The cadaver dog alerts in specific locations, the DNA questions, the timeline inconsistencies, and the physical evidence that contradicted initial claims about gemmied shutters and forced entry. His legal victories, from the Portuguese Supreme Court to the European Court of Human Rights, represent more than personal triumphs. They establish crucial precedents about the right of investigators to present evidence-based conclusions, even when those conclusions challenge powerful narratives. The Portuguese Supreme Court's explicit statement that the McCanns had not been cleared of involvement, merely that the case had been archived due to insufficient evidence, directly contradicts the media portrayal of complete exoneration. These court rulings affirm a principle often forgotten in high-profile cases: that evidence, not emotion, should guide our understanding. By repeatedly ruling that Amaral's right to present his professional conclusions outweighed concerns about the McCann's reputation, the courts recognized the fundamental importance of evidence-based discourse in a functioning democracy. Perhaps the most enduring lesson from this case is about the power of media to shape public perception. The stark contrast between how the case was reported in Britain versus Portugal created parallel realities, two entirely different understandings of the same events based on which information was emphasized or suppressed. This divergence serves as a sobering reminder that what we know about high-profile cases is often determined not by the weight of evidence, but by the effectiveness of narrative control. The rush to judgment, to embrace the abduction theory while dismissing alternative explanations, reflects our natural tendency to accept narratives that align with our preconceptions and emotional responses. It's more comforting to believe in a random predator than to consider the possibility of parental involvement, just as it's more satisfying to have a clear villain than to acknowledge the messy complexity of real-life tragedies. Yet as this case demonstrates, truth rarely conforms to our preferences for simplicity or comfort. It resides in evidence, in forensic findings, in timeline inconsistencies, and in the questions that remain unanswered despite years of investigation and millions spent on private detectives. This case demonstrates why we need to look beyond headlines, subscribe and hit the notification bell to never miss our deep dives into cases where the truth lies beneath the surface. At Criminal Instinct, we're committed to examining evidence rather than accepting convenient narratives, to asking the difficult questions that mainstream coverage often avoids. Whatever ultimately happened to Madeleine McCann, her legacy should include this vital lesson, that in our search for truth we must follow evidence wherever it leads, even when the destination challenges our assumptions and comforts. Only then can we hope to honor the victims of tragedy with the one thing they truly deserve: an honest reckoning with the facts.